Ludum Dare is one of the most popular game jams in the world. You participate against thousands of other people to see who can make the best game in 48 hours. There's a theme for each jam, and this time it was deeper and deeper. And in this video, I'm going to show how I made my video game for this game jam in just 2 days. Are you ready to get deeper and deeper into the video? Let's do this. Now, to make a game, you need ideas, and currently I had none. But eventually, I came up with an idea. You would be on a randomly generated 2D world. You would have to mine that world and search for a cube. Now, I don't know why you would be ever searching for a cube, but that was the idea that I had for my game. The idea was definitely very simple, and I could have added way more to it if I had extra time, but I didn't, so here we are. And fast forward a couple of hours later, and some of the world generation is done. There's a few caves scattered all around, and although you can't deform the terrain yet, it still looks pretty cool. But what use is terrain when you can't move around and see it? So my next move was to add a player that could move around and see all of that terrain. So I did that. But during that time, I had a few problems. You know the terrain I showed you earlier? Well, the way I set up the player, he just fell straight through it. And although Ludum Dare games are known to be buggy sometimes, this probably shouldn't be making it in. The reason I was falling straight through the floor was because the terrain only had a collider on the front of it. And since the player is on the side of the terrain instead of the front of the terrain, the player just goes straight through it. The fix for this is pretty simple. Just extend the collision of the terrain to the sides of the terrain. Well, the solution is simple, but actually programming it in is pretty hard. Fortunately, I had a set of tutorials that helped me set up the terrain generation and mesh generation. So, after following a section of that tutorial, I was able to extend the collision out, and it worked perfectly. Now, I wanted to limit your range of vision to a very small point on the screen. I wanted you to feel like you were actually in a cave. And since caves are pretty dark, citation needed, I got to work on making everything around you look pretty dark. But remember how I said, but what use is terrain when you can't move around and see it? Well, that was the reason I added the player. But the player was unable to move around, which kind of defeated its purpose. Fortunately, the movement that I programmed in was pretty simple, so it didn't take too long to make. And after just a little while of programming, the movement was done. But there was still a major problem. Well, not necessarily a problem, but a big feature missing that I wanted to add. Do you remember my big, bold ideas at the start of this video about making terrain deformation? Well, I actually need to program that in. Well, that sounds like fun. Yeah, it turned out being harder than I thought it would be. Why, you may ask? Well, let me guide you through my process. Do you see this white circle here? Well, I wanted that to be the area where when you clicked, the terrain would remove. And my first big problem was determining what points of the terrain were on that circle. My first thought is that it would require calculus or trigonometry or something, which I don't know. But no, you only need the code that's on screen right here. So after the challenge of determining what points were on the terrain removal circle, my next step was to actually remove them. Now, I had 2 options for how I wanted to remove the terrain. Option 1, the easy method, would make quite a bit of lag. Option 2, the method that would make less lag, would be much harder to do, and maybe even impossible with the time frame I had. Because I didn't want to run out of time to add other things, I decided to go with option 1. Yay, don't we just love my risk-taking skills? So now that I had made that decision, I needed to actually execute it. And I'm glad I went with this option, because even with its simplicity, it still took way too long to make. But anyway, back to how I made the terrain deformation. Now that I could get a list of all of the terrain positions that your little circle was touching, I needed to remove them. The other stuff that I had to do wasn't the hardest thing in the world, but combined, they took a pretty long while. The biggest problem with what I was doing was I was regenerating the entire world, even though just a small portion of the world was being removed. This was the cause of all of the lag that would result from you removing the terrain. and unfortunately, it made it a little less fun to play. However, once I got the terrain removal working, it was still pretty good, and I cut down on a bit of the lag later. Wait, hang on. I said the terrain removing was working. This isn't working. I'm floating in the air. You know what? I should probably fix that. Oh, the sides of the terrain that I'm actually standing on aren't updating. Well, that's just great. Apparently the reason this was happening was because there weren't some things being reset properly, so when the terrain was updating, there were errors occurring, thus preventing the size of the terrain, and therefore the collision, from working. It took me a pretty long while to realize this, but once I did, I was able to fix it. And although I hadn't applied some optimizations to it, it still was pretty fun to remove. But now I wanted to add something that prevented you from just sticking straight down to your prize. Well, I hadn't added the prize yet, but anyway, it was time to add wires. I know, best name ever, right? But anyway, these wires would need to be connected to a generator in order to be powered. And you would need to be connected to either a wire or a generator to be able to mine terrain. You would have a generator at the start, and you couldn't move it after you place it down. Now that I think about it, you should have been able to move it, but I didn't think about it while I was making it, which was kind of unfortunate, but oh well. And fast forward a few minutes later, and I had made a few indicators for how you can place everything, and if you can mine or not. But then I got sidetracked because I needed to do a more important thing, and that was your jetpack. Before I added the jetpack, you couldn't move up at all, apart from climbing up slopes that you or the terrain had made. I didn't have time to add like fuel or anything, so I just made it so that you could jump infinitely by firing pulses from your jetpack. And with all this done, I had about an hour left to do whatever I wanted with this game. You're probably asking right now, what did I decide to do? Well, let me show you a bit of gameplay from before I added this thing. It looks pretty decent, but there's no audio at all, and the mood still isn't too good. And I take pride in my sound and mood skills, so this just wasn't good enough for me. And a little bit later, I got something that I considered acceptable. I made the range that you're able to see before it fades into black a little bit smaller. I added some ambient sounds to the game, along with some sounds that play when you do stuff, such as mining terrain or placing wires. And after that was done, I was finally satisfied with the state of my game. But I want to talk about something that I messed up big time in this game. You're probably wondering, what did I mess up? I'm the perfect game developer. How could I possibly mess everything up? Well, I messed up something called the controls. To be able to move, you could only press the arrow keys. And since terrain removal was controlled by the mouse, you had to use your other hand to remove the terrain. And that might seem perfect at first because you're using every hand to do every single task in the game. Except you're not. Remember these wires you need to be connected to be able to mine? Well, you place those with E, and at least on a normal keyboard, E is nowhere close to the arrow keys or the mouse. Which means, if you ever want to place a wire, you need to take your hand off the arrow keys and put it on E. Once you're done placing the wire, you need to move your hand all the way back to the arrow buttons to be able to continue moving. That may not seem too painful at first, but if you play the game, trust me, it's not a very enjoyable experience. Yeah. So the controls were pretty bad, but apart from that, my game was pretty good. The game will be linked in the description, and I would encourage you to check it out. But yeah, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you again sometime soon. Remember to leave a like and subscribe, maybe comment something. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Bye.